afternoon. So first of all, we have Professor Lendlein, who from Professor of Materials in Life Sciences from University of Potsdam. And then we have Assistant Prof. Conrad Joyce, Assistant Prof. at Architecture and Sustainable Design of SUTD. And we have Miss Veronica Chee, CEO of H Group. And last but not least, Assistant Prof. Shrike Zhang at Harvard Medical School. So folks, we have half an hour for this panel discussion. And maybe to start off, I think one of the very key areas today, I think facing Mother Earth is the issue about sustainability. And I just want to pose this question to all members here. Sustainability is becoming an urgent factor, especially in healthcare, right? We see especially there's waste from diagnostic devices, relatively high carbon footprint of hospitals. Just want to know what are your thoughts and advice on this topic. So this question is open to all. Any one of you can share your view on based on what you have been discussing about, but viewing it from the sustainability perspective.
Maybe I could start.
Yes, please, Andreas.
On that topic, I think that as we will have a certain of people who have a disease or require treatment in the hospital, but we need to ensure that those treatments are effective and curative. Curative means we one time fix the issue, and then hopefully the patient do not have to go back to the hospital. So any type of regular treatment will be a burden in terms of sustainability. So therefore, therapies have a clear direction from my perspective in that context. And the other point of sustainability is what can we do before we come to the condition that somebody has to go to the hospital. This means the investments in diagnostics, and especially such diagnostics that can be performed at home and remotely and that are efficient might be another way to approach the topic. And systems that we can install in the house, like build living structures to improve the living conditions, especially for our seniors.
I think Andreas made a great point. I think in our field, sort of startup world, it is often looking at accessibility, right? When you make something that's accessible, it's sort of two sides of a coin, right? So do we worry about overconsumption as things become more available, potentially, as we look at kind of our consumer buying behavior? Yes, but I think largely when we look at accessibility is bringing the right technology to the person and when they need it. That's when we look at that. Technology has supported a lot of these activities that we don't have to actually physically see our doctors. The medicines are delivered to us, and some of the technologies that are quite interesting is sort of kind of, if you look at sort of big, heavy-duty machines being miniaturized, immobilized, so that you can use it anywhere. In diagnostics, you are quite interesting when you see sort of laboratory business. You look at having this large machine having to run 200 tests, so that it's efficient because it's a large machine, you can just put one test. There's a lot of ways could be created in, manpower, electricity, reagent, and also at a compromise of time and being able to respond quickly. So I see a lot of sort of technology supporting that. And largely, I see maybe more from the business side is how do we create a sustainable sort of business model, right, where people actually benefit. When we look at that, shifting sort of hospital care to primary care, to home care, to personal care. So that area is quite exciting for us to look at as well, to the healthcare startup world.
Yeah, nice that you mentioned Veronica, because one of my colleagues was or still is working on a portable MRI, which is really make it useful. You can bring to anywhere you want.
Actually, in fact, I think I made a visit a few months ago. Chua took me a visit and I look at the portable MRI.
Okay.
Quite interesting.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can specifically ask this next question to both Andreas and Shrike, since they have been working quite a fair bit on well, some aspect of 3D printing. As you know, in the last 2 years since COVID, there has been a lot of supply chain issue, right? I mean, a lot of supply chains were choked. And I recall as far back as 2 years ago, we were running short of nasal swabs because I think both Italy and US, they were hit quite badly, and they are two big manufacturers of nasal swabs. And I think we look to 3D printing as one of the solutions to get us nasal swabs. I just want to ask your opinion, whether do you see any potential gaps, the use of 3D printing? Because one of the problems we have is always scalability, right? It's just not a mass production technique. And while 3D printing can help you to have your PPEs, even isolation wards, you know, for some rural area, ventilators, so and so on. But do you see the gaps there in view of COVID? Shrike and Andreas.
Sure, maybe I can. Yeah. So I mean, definitely. I think. Yeah, actually, in the beginning of COVID, even us were actually involved in some of the printing works that we did for the hospital here, where we were able to actually print some of the like PPEs and yeah, a little bit on the ventilators, not too much, but primarily on some of the PPEs that we're able to create for the hospital. So yeah, I definitely see there's a little, I mean, there is some availability or I mean need there, depending, I think, on which stage we are at potentially at the pandemic. I think one thing is that from this pandemic, I think we're going to learn that, I mean, how to prepare potentially for future pandemics, and do think that the 3D printing is something that people have been really starting to look into as a potential alternative to. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be more for mass production, but at least if you want to design something to begin with, I mean, that might be something interesting to have some prototypes being made and tested before actually going to the final, I mean, mass production by some other methods for sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. What about you, Andreas? Any thoughts?
I think, first of all, 3D printing already have some applications. So they have made this step, especially for personalized medical devices. If we need to fit a medical device exactly to a patient, that is the strength of 3D printing. And in some pharmacies, we meanwhile have 3D printers who can print tablets with the exact amount of the drug that is needed for a newborn. So there are some proofs that this technology works. And the question is, what could be the large-scale application? So from my perspective, today, the hospitals need to have a lot of medical devices on shelf, waiting there to be used. And there is an end of the shelf lifetime, and then those medical devices cannot be used anymore. So it would be ideal if instead of storing real medical devices, we could print on demand whatever we need. So we would store just computer files and some raw materials and then print those devices. But that is a vision, I would say, but it could be the direction where it is aiming at. If you look at the automotive industry, for instance, here 3D printing technology are already applied in that way. So they are not substituting parts to repair cars that are on the shelf, but they are individually printed today, especially for elder cars, but I think that will be a storage concept also in the future. That might be a direction we could work towards too.
Very nice concept of print on demand. So it's really to make obsolescence obsolete. So you don't have to worry about big warehouses. And for NASA, I remember they were trying to put a food printer on a space mission. Food on demand, you need it, you print it. All right, maybe now I will move the next question to Veronica and Sam. Now, Singapore MOH, Ministry of Health, vision for healthcare has three emphases. I think you're probably familiar. Beyond healthcare to health, I think Veronica was talking about this. Beyond hospital to community, and beyond quality to value. So to achieve this vision, some of the enablers can include healthcare solutions outside of hospitals, nudging of human behavior, I think Veronica spoke about that, and better prognosis of health trajectory. So what are your thoughts on achieving this aspiration? And I would like to direct this question to Sam and Veronica.
Sam, please.
I mean, I think, I mean, those goals are very amicable, and I think they're the right kind of approach, right? In terms of sort of, yeah, getting us away from, you know, kind of very, very heavy clinical interventions into something that's much more about people's habits that push, you know, kind of healthier activity. Both in terms of, you know, yeah, as Veronica sort of was talking about, sort of getting early treatment, but I guess also in my domain, it's about the city kind of working for people, you know, to have healthy activities and to kind of promote a healthy lifestyle. I think that's something that we sort of tend not to look at quite so much. You know, we're often looking at people once they have problems. We've got a lot of collaborations with Cheng General Hospital, and the constant issue is that people come when something's wrong. They don't come kind of before that, which of course makes sense. But you know, often by that time it's more difficult to control. Whereas if maybe they'd kind of come earlier, then, you know, much kind of less invasive, more habitual type activities, you know, would be there. So from my point of view, I'm very interested in how the city can help promote that. I think there's lots of examples, and this also talks to the sustainability side. There's a sort of a potential win-win here, that if you have cities that are easy to walk around, then people do walk around, then they get a nice bit of activity every day. You know, it's not a sort of super sort of scientific solution. It's much more kind of social, habitual sort of side of things. And the environments that we live in, the cities that we live in, sort of undoubtedly affect our behaviors in that way. And I think we sort of need to understand that a little bit more about various cities promote or, you know, sort of push people away from living healthier lives. So that's, I think, my interest in that side of things, that maybe we almost need to think of our daily lives and the cities that we work in as, you know, kind of health, you know, the health area as well. And I think, you know, companies have done some great stuff looking at how we can actually think about it in that way and sort of say, okay, where's the opportunity here that we can help people do things that are positive for their health and well-being. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Any thoughts, Veronica?
Oh, I think Sam brought up some good points. I'm quite inherently interested in how we design our environment, especially in the really sort of dense population, city, country, to help people to live well and live better. I think our point of view is that I don't think we have a choice right now. I think what the country is facing, and many nations are facing, is that rising healthcare cost, aging population, right, and lower quality of life. Because, you know, as we live longer, the last part of our life, you know, generally the quality of life decreases because we have diseases. Even though we have treatment, we have procedures to sustain our life, but last part of life generally have lower quality. So it's interesting to kind of shift the sort of mindset of, you know, what can we do earlier, right? Now that Singapore is already doing. I think the government side, the public sector side is already doing decentralized healthcare, building community care, right? Giving more responsibility to the primary care physicians, assigning individuals to a primary care physicians, and provide subsidies. Lots of measures have been put in place by the government. What we, from the private sector, is how do we actually work together with the government? How do we, how can we enable an environment that more technologies can come in? There are some work in the regulatory side we need to look at, and the things that are approved elsewhere. Often it's difficult, right? So we look at sort of traditional sort of way of proving a concept. This thing works. You know, we have to do a really long time of health economic studies to prove that it works. And there is at least some room for some experiments in Singapore that will really kind of can help us from a private sector to promote and do our part to help kind of shift the care away from sick care.
Mm. So, Veronica,
I have a question for Sam here in that context.
Please go ahead, Andrea.
I think we have another grand challenge that we have not yet discussed, which is the climate change. And especially in cities, sometimes we have the microclimate aspects. And if we are looking at the current pandemic, we see really differences in the summertime with wetter condition where we do not have such a big issue, and in the winter when it becomes worse. Are there any prediction for the urban areas how microclimate can have an influence on health conditions and social behavior?
Mm-hmm. Sam, you have any comment?
Yeah, I'm best placed to do that. I mean, undoubtedly, climate change is sort of changing our cities, and I think a lot of kind of modernist architecture, you know, the sort of 30s and 40s spent a lot of time kind of ignoring actually a lot of the kind of intelligent design that was made to be climatically aware. I think the kind of invention of air conditioning, whilst kind of a phenomenal benefit in some regards, also allowed us to kind of ignore, you know, efficiency and how buildings kind of wanted to work in the environment, how we could kind of situate ourselves in the environment in kind of low energy ways. And now we're sort of beginning to count, you know, how we use energy and how we reduce it. I think an intrinsic part of that as the city is just the scale of the city as well. And, you know, again, in the sort of 50s and so on, we got used to sort of navigating large distances with cars, whereas the kind of traditional medieval kind of city was much smaller. The streets were smaller as well, so they provided natural shade, and we had things like a lot more trees and vegetation. So those helped to kind of reduce the climatic effects. I think in Southeast Asia, where actually we don't really have a winter necessarily in Singapore, we have a rainy season, you know, we kind of understand that in terms of, you know, how do we kind of respond well to the environment, using kind of larger roofs, you know, sort of more shading, sort of cross ventilation, etc. And I think what's interesting is that sort of, I think Singapore, as one of the kind of foremost in this, people like Woha and so on, are kind of bringing us back to that. They're sort of working out how we shake modernism and sort of bring it back to a more naturally sensitive kind of environment. But it's sort of taking a while to sort of undo some of those design sensibilities. As I say, I think what's driving that a lot is actually getting much more hands-on with the data, because prior to that, we didn't really have to worry so much about our impact on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And now it's becoming possible to, you know, thermal cameras, you know, Internet of Things type sensing, we're able to kind of get some numbers on this better and better. What I find really interesting, however, it's worth noting, is that cities generally are actually incredibly efficient. The people that are inefficient are the people driving massive distances every day from the countryside into a small city. You know, the amount of energy consumed there is a lot more than an individual in a very compact, efficient city. If you think about Manhattan, you know, people who actually travel small distances. So per person, they're actually incredibly efficient. They have systems in place to do that. But obviously we have an inherent issue with the scale. So that's also again a much larger issue about, you know, as we sort of, the cities are where lots of people live, and they live, generally speaking, very efficiently per person. But, you know, the scale of those cities is inherently also an issue. But, you know, energy systems and so on can help that. It's easier to solve that kind of across a large city than necessarily for all these kind of individuals that are sort of highly scattered. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. So, Andreas, are you happy with that man on climate change? Another one of the big issues of our time.
I find it very interesting that it is so important to collect all of those data as a basis before we can make changes that we need to analyze. That seems like a very reasonable concept.
Yeah. So nowadays we say data is the new currency. Without data, we can't do anything. All right, I have one more last question, and I will address it to Veronica. We are here all academics except you, so coming from the private sector, just want to ask, in your opinion, how can the private sector do more in partnering Ministry of Health on this journey to provide quality healthcare as demand rises with the aging population?
And this very interesting question. I think that sort of question is bilateral, right? So how can we do more, and then how can the private sector also do more? And I think there's always an inherent interest. The size of the company matters. I think, like sort of resources you have to manage the collaboration with the public sector, because inherently, I think in private sector's point of view, it requires resources from our side to work with the team. And number two, I'm talking maybe sort of in a perception as well, is the length of engagement is long. And we have, especially in the healthcare sort of field, right? We look at sort of engagement that, I'm not saying to drop all the protocols. I think that's sort of other challenges if we look at from, again, taking a design thinking perspective, right? If I say I really like to work with the public sector, I really want to work with NUH. We've had in my previous life as a startup and as a bigger company, but it generally just involves a lot of processes and quite a lot of time and resources. And so initiatives like sort of private-public partnerships, some of the programs that I think SUTD is pretty progressive in that, in having the students, the researchers, the liaison office to work to approach private sectors. And that's really quite good. Allows something that's sort of a definitive timeline, very specific goals, and something that's achievable. I think for private sector, and that's important to be able to engage and work collaboratively.
Thanks a lot. So now I think we come to the closing of today's afternoon session. Thank you for making time in your busy schedule. I think it has been very beneficial, especially for me. So I hope to see the rest of you again. There will be another day tomorrow, and hope to see you in the sessions. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.